you guys mentioned the pandemic was a big part of, realizing just how bad the internet problem is in broadband. Were you seeing problems before that? Like, was the pandemic really the kickstart, or was it before?
No, I've been long aware of some of the impacts of the growing digital divide. What I think I was noting is that the pandemic increased our need for broadband, high-speed broadband that was affordable, and that I think we have a moment where this is understood in many more ways than it was before the pandemic started. So people recognize that this is a necessity, it is a critical part of our infrastructure, and that we need to invest in getting universal access to broadband.
In the 1970s, the United States federal government did a bunch of energy plans, putting a bunch of electricity into rural homes. Is the federal government now, is the plan with this legislation to do something similar with broadband internet?
Yes, certainly President Biden announced an aspiration that through his infrastructure plan that we should be able to reach every home, and that it was no longer a luxury or something that you might have if you could afford it. It is something that is a necessity in our education system, in our healthcare system, and most importantly in our economy. And because the digital divide is most pronounced in rural areas, it is leaving rural America behind that we don't have high-speed broadband access, and we can't permit that.
How do you balance, and so we've had a lot of different, this has been a conversation for years, how do we balance the money that's coming in from the states, the federal money that's already been coming in, and making the best use of that money so that we're not just continuing to spend taxpayer dollars?
Right. One of the frustrations you heard during this roundtable today, and that I expressed at the outset, is a concern that with multiple agencies at multiple levels of government trying to address this problem, that there is not enough coordination. And frankly, there's also not enough transparency and accountability. And so I certainly support making this robust investment, and the bipartisan infrastructure plan contains a pretty robust and bold investment into broadband expansion. But that won't be enough. We will have to have really vigilant oversight of those dollars, transparency, and these dollars are dollars that come from people who have telecommunication services and pay various fees and taxes, and we have a responsibility to steward those carefully.
So with the stories and the comments you heard today from Marathon County, was there anything that surprised you or that you think is particularly unique to places like Marathon County, where you have one spot that's very kind of metropolitan and then the rest is rural?
Well, I can say that a state like Wisconsin has, it's sort of a reflection of counties like Marathon County. We have a few really big cities in the state, but most of our communities are smaller cities, smaller towns, and we have a very, we have a huge swaths of rural population. And that does cause complexities for getting broadband out to everyone, but in our nation's history, we decided that everybody should have electricity. And there was a rural electrification initiative that got the last mile to every home in our state and across the country. We had the ambition to have an interstate highway system, and we made the investments necessary to make that a reality. Today, we have an opportunity to work together to make an investment in getting broadband to every household, and we need to do that.
This is a complicated issue, lots of different little pieces to make it all work. So what can people look forward to see specifically, whether it's making those maps better or getting companies on board and incentivized and held accountable for helping out? What are the initiatives that you're hoping to kind of go through?
Yeah, well, I think breaking down some of the barriers that a community like Marathon County has faced. You heard the chair of the committee looking at broadband access say, we had this initiative in this year and things didn't change very much. We had this initiative in this next year. That's, it's apparent to me that there's a lot of folks who aren't being held to account and aren't being good stewards of at least the public dollars that are involved in this, and that we have to really bring them to the table and make sure that we're seeing results for the investments we make.
Do you personally believe that broadband internet should be a right?
I believe that we should increasingly look at it as a public utility, just like we would telephone service, electrical service, and and I also made the comparison to the interstate highway system. I think that one of the comments I thought that was really interesting was thinking ahead. We don't know how technology will change to deliver high-speed services in the future. There was some discussion about deployment of more low Earth orbit satellites. NASA's looking at doing that. So I don't think that we can be, I think we have to be technology neutral as we move forward, but I think we must recognize that a digital divide is harming particularly our rural communities.
So one thing that stood out to me in the discussion today was the fact that a lot of people think the current broadband definition from the FCC just doesn't work anymore.
Yes.
As a legislature, how do you work to let the FCC know that, hey, this is what people are saying, how do we fix this, how do we change this?
Well, I'm fortunate to sit on the Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over the FCC. And periodically we have those commissioners right before us. And so one of the ways is simply through the committee to ask those questions and ultimately to either formally urge them to update their upload and download standards, or if they don't budge, to introduce legislation that would require them to look at that. But I do think we should be building to the future. It would be a tragedy to make the investment of the scale that we're looking at right now to every home and have it obsolete by the time it's up and running.
Do you think the private sector should be doing more to be getting broadband internet to the rural communities instead of the governments?
I think the way we have internet services and broadband services structured, the private sector plays an enormous role. But as a private sector, they also have the right to keep their proprietary information to themselves. And one of the roadblocks we see is just not knowing where that middle mile is. If you don't, I'm using jargon, but they've laid a lot of fiber across the state in their service territories. And local planning could be a lot more effective and a lot more effective if we knew where those things are. If you look at pipelines, we know where they are. If you look at transmission lines, you know where they are. But because of this way in which broadband has been deployed historically, we just don't have that information. And I think figuring out how to get it is going to be a key.
And I guess biggest friction when it comes to getting these kinds of things passed and into legislation?
Biggest friction?
Yeah.
I would say, in a very hopeful way, that this is one of the things that I wholeheartedly agree with many of my Republican colleagues on. When you represent an entire state, as we all do in the Senate, you're much more likely to have a mix of rural and urban and suburban areas. And I think every senator who's paid attention to this issue sees that parts of their state are going to be left behind, and sections of the people that they represent will be left behind if we don't come together to get this job done.